That's cute. That is cute. Do you think it was Queen Victoria who wrote that? It wasn't the Queen who wrote that. And the rumors are that Lewis Carroll was but a pen name for, but a front.
Pish tush. No.
Yeah. Super. Okay. Is that 30 seconds we got?
Okay, ready?
Do you have audio, by the way, audio check?
Yeah, I got it.
Because we've been talking, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, yeah, it's on.
Super. In Canadian history, a lot of our things that are most familiar to us, Medicare, socialism, the NDP, come out of Saskatchewan. In fact, Saskatchewan had the first university faculty in Canada for theatre, in fact, in the Commonwealth. And if I'm not mistaken, Francis, you went there and graduated.
I did indeed. My mentor, or one of them at that time, was Professor Emery Smaldwin Jones. You'll never guess that he was a Welshman. And he was the head of the department. And he had previously, my other great mentor was a remarkable woman named Mary Ellen Burgess. When in Saskatchewan, they founded the Saskatchewan Recreation Movement, which was for taking music and causing local communities to make their own music, very much in keeping with the whole policies of the CCF at that time. I always say, I grew up thinking that government was to help people solve their problems. When Tommy Douglas and his group were going around the province saying, what do you mean these children can't go to school because they have no shoes? We'll fix that. So the Saskatchewan Recreation Movement was in a sense an offshoot of that, to give the quality of life of isolated people's value and meaning and pleasure. And there was this marvelous woman, as I say, Mary Ellen Burgess, who taught a little school class of us in what I later realized, when I was so frightened of the word improvisation, because I didn't know what it meant, I discovered I'd been doing it all along with Mary Ellen. You know, the phone rings, it's bad news, tell me the story, and things like that. And she used to do little one-act plays that were part of the Dominion Drama Festival thing. And I won little silver cups and so on from Emrys Jones. So when he went to Saskatoon, I went along as a student. And it was he who got me scholarships to, first of all, go to Ottawa and audition for RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, and eventually to, when I was accepted, to travel there. These were organizations in Saskatchewan like the Princess Pat's Club and the IODE. To this day, I don't know who they were. I'm very grateful to them because we had no money. It was we're just pulling out of the Depression, just barely. The war was on and so on. But my mother gallantly gave up a small amount of money a week to support me. And these groups gave me the money to travel to London. And then I won a scholarship there, which kept me in the school. But in those days, in Canada, generally there wasn't a whole lot of professional theatre. So those of us who were excited and interested and wanted to pursue a career did little theatre work, the Dominion Drama Festival work. And I was extraordinarily lucky to have two very remarkable teachers at that time. And good luck.
Is it not possible that since you acted from a very young age, that perhaps the profession was in a way foisted on you?
No, it wasn't. I chose it. I chose it, and I've told this story before, but it's a true one. My granddad had very, very little formal education. He was of a yeoman farmer family in Cornwall, emigrated to Canada, emigrated eventually out west, and that's my little dog Rufus who's making that noise. Shut up! Shut up! No! Shut up, she suggested. No!
No.
Absolutely not. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking about a teacher you had?
Mary Ellen, amongst others, and Emrys. And that was, I think I was experienced. Oh, no, I was talking about what first got me started. My granddad, as I say, was a man of very little formal education, but he had a wonderful mind and a wonderful love of words. And he used to read books out loud to me. He loved anything he called a good yarn. First book I ever heard, I think I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I heard all of Moby Dick. The whole thing, including the flensing, the whales, and everything. He read me Henty. One summer we read Crime and Punishment, chapter about to each other. We'd never heard of, we called him Dost, because we didn't know how you pronounce the name. Nobody had ever told us that Dostoevsky was one of the great masters of modern literature. We just thought it was a hell of a good detective story. We wanted to find out who won, the detective or Rask, we called him, because we couldn't know how to pronounce Raskolnikov either. So I had a wonderful grounding in language, and I shared that passion with him. So the first time I heard a teacher say, "the multitudinous seas incarnadine," I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't stop thinking of it. It still sends shivers up and down my spine. So I was, in fact, very well educated in the drama. And one year, how it ever came to be in my grandfather's library, I don't know. Somebody, one of his daughters maybe, sent him a copy of a book on the Diaghilev Russian ballet. And the frontispiece in the book was a picture of Nijinsky in Scheherazade. And I looked at that picture and I knew that wherever that world was, that was where I was going to go. And I just quietly went on going there in spite of all good advice to the contrary, to get a real job, to, did I think there was something special about me and all that stuff you're apt to be faced with. I just kind of went limp and they suggested I take a secretarial course, I think. And it just sort of somehow went by me. And eventually I went to London to study, thanks to those people.
It's also characterized that you had a broken family. Is that true, per se?
Yes, I only knew my father for 1 year. He and my mother separated when I was very tiny, a baby. And then they tried again for a year in Regina. I liked him very much, but it didn't work for them, so he disappeared out of my life again. I later discovered that he had, over the long years, kept press books, and when I eventually came back to Canada and to the States and was doing television and whatnot, he followed it faithfully and was very fond, and I think sad that we hadn't known each other really. But my mother was a remarkable person, another book lover.
How did your mother encourage you? Did she encourage you in your trade?
Well, she didn't exactly encourage me. I think it frightened her. I think she wanted me to be safe, having lived through those long, ghastly years of the Depression. Did you know that young teachers at that time got no salary? They signed a contract, but what they got was the money to travel to the school, usually a little one-room teacherage somewhere out in the prairie. And they got the money to come home for Christmas, to go back after Christmas, and to come home at the end of the year. And in between they had like toothpaste money, and they boarded with people in them. But they had, for 10 years, she earned no salary at all. They were very tough times. And so while she was out teaching, I was living with my grandparents and had the great good fortune to get to know my grandfather very well. She was a remarkable woman in a way. She should have been, with better luck, she should have gone on into university. She was a scholar, passionate book lover, a great devout scholar of English literature and Canadian literature. That was the other marvelous thing that we got at the University of Saskatchewan then, was Carlisle King was our professor of English, and he was, I think, the first in Canada to teach a course on Canadian literature. So I was acquainted with Stegner and every McLennan, all of the greats. I didn't realize that they were ignored as much, because I knew them. P.K. Page, I fell in love with then and have been in love with ever since. We've become good friends. So it's a remarkable university. It still is. One of the first to set up courses for Native Canadians to upgrade their skills so that they could enter, professions that would hitherto been closed to them. It's a very remarkable, I'm very proud of it. I'm an en doc there, and I'm very proud of that.
Fortunately, they export most of the great talent from that province.
Oh no, there's still a lot of people at the university who prefer to stay because they love the province and are proud of it, and hope to help it through the huge difficulties we're going through now.
Do you recall, just as an aside here, any great theatres that are lost from Saskatchewan by fire that you may have played that you recall, or that have closed for bankruptcy or whatever? Any theatres you miss from that province?
No, to be perfectly honest, there were many. When I was there with Canadian Players, for example, we usually played in the Capitol Theatre chain. There weren't really theatres per se, there were cinemas, you know. The Globe came into being through Ken Kramer, and I don't know, that building is still there, I think, but they have built a new one or created this space in one of the markets in Regina, which is now the Globe Theatre, which is a theatre in the round and very beautiful and very popular, I'm happy to say. I'm not aware if there were other theatres that were lost. I left very young, you see, I was only just 18 when I left and went to England. I'm not aware if that is the case. But certainly there are 2 very good theatres flourishing now in Saskatoon and one in Regina, which for a population of that size isn't bad, you know.
If I may jump ahead for a little bit, I'll come back to Rada and all that, but Manitoba, MTS, you did something at the
MTC.
MTC,
Yeah,
Theatre Centre.
I did. That was after I'd come back from England. When I first came back to go to Stratford, I hadn't really expected to stay. I just came to do the 1 season, but before I left before that season finished, Tyrone Guthrie had already asked me to come back the next year and play Portia. Well, I wasn't going to turn that down. So it would have meant if I'd gone back to England in the interim, I would have had time to do some television, of which I'd done quite a lot, but I wouldn't have had time to commit myself to a play because I would be due back in Canada. So I decided to stay on, and I went to the Crest Theatre, run by what I call the Davy. That's Murray and Donald Davis and their sister Barbara Chilcott. And I played a show for them, and I went out to MTC for my first time to work with John Hirsch in an astonishing production of Mother Courage, which is still much talked about. Now, in Mother Courage, there were Douglas Rain, Martha Henry, Bill Needles, Len Carew, Paul Gross, Heath Lamberts, Zoe Caldwell, myself, and sort of other. It was an astonishing cast, and it was an astonishing production, because you see, John, I don't know whether you know that John lost all his family during the Holocaust in Europe, and himself spent time in Auschwitz as a child, managed to survive, and the hard winters in Budapest, where he used to tell us the bodies were stacked up like cordwood because they couldn't bury them, the ground was too. Anyway, it was a pretty horrific time. So when we came to do a play like Mother Courage, and we would be acting fear and things, and John said, no, that isn't what happens. When they come in the middle of the night, you try to turn yourself into a stone. You say, let them take my mother, my father, but not me, let them not notice me, let them. So the net result was that we played the play with a minimum of acting, which made it, I think, immensely compelling for the audience. And I learned so much from that man about going back to my own roots. While I was in England, I behaved like a young English woman because I didn't want to get just stuck in American roles in the theatre. And when I'd ask John questions about, he'd say, but Franny, you lived through the Great Depression. You know what it was like when men came to the door who were starving and you were frightened of them, but you wanted to share what food you had. You know the basis of this play. You've lived through a war in a sense. You've lived through utter devastation. You've seen plagues of locusts, for heaven's sake. You've lived in a very big canvas. And as soon as I began to be able to tune in on that out of my own life and the people I'd watched being destroyed by the Depression, that's what really, I think, was the basic reason for my although I did go back to England and play, and I did go to the States and so on, for why I've stayed here, because I was acting better, frankly, because I was using my own source material.
Of course, it would have been very difficult to resist the Guthrie invitation to come back and.
Oh, he didn't turn Tony Guthrie down. You know, he was 6'7" or something or other, and he just said, "Got a lovely theatre at home that you ought to come back." Okay. And he was a great, great director, you know. Peter Brook came along later. I also had the good fortune to work with him. In this country, we got Robert Lepage, who I think is the greatest innovator and door opener since Peter Brook. You know, maybe Hans Cotton and a few others.
Barrymore says you quite courageously, though, turned your back on an extremely promising career in Britain. And you were just mentioning that you did quite a bit of television work and were becoming quite recognizable there.
Oh, yes. Yes.
But you came back. Why exactly did you come back?
Well, I came back, as I say, because Tony Guthrie said, "Come with me, I want you to do Isabella," and that would have been stupid to turn down. Besides, I also coincidentally lived in the same little apartment hotel in London with Irene Worth, who had been here for the first year and had told me what a magnificent theatre and experience it was. And then, as I say, I stayed for that one season, in between seasons. Then I did another season there. And meantime, I'd met this fella, you see. And one thing led to another. And I had toured with the Canadian Players, with Dougie Campbell, whom I love. He is a remarkable man of the theatre, and I think we're very lucky that he too has made his home in this country. And I'd travelled. On Canadian Players, we did about 80,000 miles a year, you know, in a little old bus, chuntering around the countryside from Flin Flon to Birmingham, Alabama, where we very nearly ended up in the Birmingham jail, because we'd been to a party the night before at a black college, and in our innocence, we went and had coffee, and we danced, and we had hamburgers, and listened to some good music, and we chatted. And the sheriff arrived the next morning and said, "Now, y'all don't understand that our colored folk you see down here don't really like being disturbed in that sort of way. Now, I understand you actually dancing. Well, this would embarrass them, you see. So I'm going to let it go this time, but I am sending the word ahead of you. So perhaps you just be a little more polite and cautious with him." Well, at which point I thought Max Helpman was about to kill the sheriff, when we would indeed have all ended up in, or was it Bruno Gerussi? I can't remember. Anyway, there's some pretty angry people about. But in the course of that, not only were we exploring huge areas of the States, but I was also exploring my own country. I hadn't been to Kamloops before, or Vancouver, because I came straight back from London to Stratford to Toronto, which I had not known at all. And it's pretty impressive.
These places were all bringing you familiarity with your country.
That's right.
What were you bringing them as the Canadian Players? What essence, what were they getting that they can't get in a movie screen, for example?
Well, they were getting live performances with real live human beings that they were all in a big room with, which is a very different experience from cinema, as you know. And they were seeing some magnificent plays, which they perhaps otherwise. It was Dougie's whole philosophy, you see, was it's all very nice to have Stratford, this beautiful theatre with a good-sized budget, though it wasn't so big in those days as it is now, doing wonderful plays by Shakespeare, etc., etc. But what about all the rest of the country, which is quite a bit larger than Stratford? So that was his whole intention. And we toured, the ones that I was involved with were Hamlet, St. Joan, Peer Gynt, and one other, which I can't remember at the moment. And they were done with practically no costume. But they were done, in other words, in St. Joan, the fellows all wore grey suits, beautifully tailored grey suits. If Bill Hutt was coming as the Archbishop, he stuck on a purple bib with a cross on it, and he was the Archbishop. When he came as the Earl of Warwick, he took that insignia off and became the Earl of Warwick. My husband, George McCowan, played the Dauphin, the very slightly scatty Dauphin, by just taking his jacket off. And later in the play, he played the Inquisitor, who has that incredible 8-minute speech on the meaning of the Inquisition. And he just put his jacket and tie on and was the Inquisitor. So they saw I think some uninterrupted flow of the language of the plays. There was nothing to distract. I still to this day find it hard to see a full-scale production of Joan with the panoply and the banners and the armor and the flags and the scarlets and crimsons and golds, because I remember hearing the play so vividly because there was no distraction. And it was very fulfilling work.
It sounds remarkably like radio, really, when you have more than...
No, it wasn't even remotely like radio, because there was a good deal of activity. It wasn't just static, it wasn't a platform reading, it was a fully acted production. But in Peer Gynt, the Troll King's castle was 2 ladders with a plank across and all of us in Halloween masks. But people say to me, oh, I love that scene in Joan when you went to the court. Well, of course we didn't go to the court, nothing changed, but they saw it that way because they heard us responding as though that's where we were.
Could you please tell me about the people at the head of the Canadian Players? You mentioned you had attended a eulogy the other day.
Yes, a memorial service for a remarkable woman named Laurel Crosby. Well, Canadian Players began through a small group which consisted of mostly Douglas Campbell, Anne Casson, his wife at the time, Robin Patterson, who was Tom's wife, and how Laurel got into the act I don't quite remember, but eventually Robin Patterson and Laurel Crosby managed the Canadian Players, and we went out and did the acting and they managed it and created the bookings and so on. And they were a couple of tough ladies. It was hard to turn them down. Communities would say, oh, well, I don't know whether our people are really ready for this, but they just wouldn't take no for an answer. And then once we'd been once or twice to a community, they would write and say, can you come this year? Can you come this year? And it was astonishing. And I like to think that because of the Canadian Players, people in each community, like Winnipeg, like Calgary, like Edmonton, like Regina and whatnot, said, well, this is causing quite a furore. People are obviously hungry for this kind of experience, so why don't we make our own? And they would get together in committees, and I have a very strong feeling that the Canadian Players was a very formidable forming influence in the network now of the regional theatres that go right across from sea to shining sea, as Peter Zosky keeps reminding us.
Remembering the North there, it was a financial nightmare.
Pardon?
Financially, how did it do? The miles of Canada, traveling around, what kind of money did you make? What sort of a challenge did they face Crosby?
We didn't make very much money, as I remember. We were too busy to spend it anyway, even if we had been making any, so it didn't really matter. And they were done on very slender budgets. And of course the mileage, but we were traveling by bus. How well I remember it. You can get pretty tired of greasy spoons and things. But, and we did cover an enormous mileage. I've no idea, I expect we were running on a shoestring. We made enough money, to be able to holiday afterwards. And most of us, of course, went immediately. Canadian Players would finish and we'd go back to Stratford for them. So we were doing all right.
There was some donation from one of Canada's first ladies.
Lady Eaton. She was our patroness, I guess you'd say. A doughty lady. My golly, she was a feisty Scottish lady. We were rehearsing the first summer that I was with the company, rehearsing St. Joan in Lake Cashagawigamog, which belonged to Robin Patterson's family, and it was for girls, a summer camp for girls. So there we all were, people like Bruno and George McCowan and Max Helpman and Douglas, in little cabins called gnomes, or dwarfs, or elves, and Millie Hall and I, and fairies. And there was a central lodge, with great big huge fireplace and things. And Lady Eaton, who was in considerable pain most of the later years of her life, she had dreadful, I think it was rheumatoid arthritis, had to sleep bolt upright in a chair, and was in great pain, but she had herself ferry all the way up there and brought with her bottles of dimpled scotch to tide us through. She was She passionately loved the theatre. Was a great patron at Stratford also. And she loved the fact that we were going out to tiny little communities that didn't have this otherwise, you know.
Didn't want to skip over, but we did, and we'll do this briefly. After Stratford, I understand it was the Davai who
Yes.
invited you to the Crest. Can you tell me a bit about your experience at the Crest?
Oh, it was wonderful. I liked them very much, for one thing. We did a very interesting play by Graham Greene called The Living Room, which my friend Dorothy Tewton had just played in London, so I knew the play very well because I'd gone to see Toots in it. And it was highly professional, very well organized, and it did a number of Canadian plays, which people tend to forget. It did the early Rob Davies, but it also was a kind of clearinghouse for the new European drama. People in Toronto could see plays, the contemporaries, some of them still running in New York or in London, in Paris, in Berlin, and so on. And they covered a very wide range, and they used a lot of people whose names are, goodness knows, very familiar. Kate Reid, Charmian King, Gordy Pinson, you know, just a roster of quite remarkable productions. I think they have every right to be proud.
How long did that last? Was that a simple?
The Crest? Oh, I don't know. You'd have to talk to Donald about that.
How long did you stay
A number of years.
Can you tell me about Leo Chichery? We heard a little bit about it.
Sure. Leo was a delightful man and a splendid actor who was a very principal actor at Stratford for a number of years, who was killed tragically in a highway accident one night after a play. What can I tell you about him? He was talented, he was generous, he was funny, he was a splendid actor and a great member of the Stratford community. We were a much smaller community in those days, of course. Maximum, I would say, maybe 35 actors. Now it's, of course, huge, as you know. And we only did 2 plays a season to begin with, plus some experimental work. But enchanting things going on at the casino, which is a Quonset hut. And Marcel Marceau came to play the Soldier's Tale, Stravinsky. And Benjamin Britten came to play concerts, and Elizabeth Schwarzkopf came, and all sorts of, you know, it was very exhilarating. And also because it was so new in the world, critics and theatre people were coming from Moscow, from Paris, from Genoa, from all over the world. So it was a huge ferment, an intellectual ferment, which was very, very exciting.
You played under a tent for a while.
We certainly did.
Tell me about the tent.
The tent was hot. It was very beautiful, but it was also very hot. And people used to feel sorry for the fellows because they were running around in armor and great swords going clang and bang. And we were dressed in what appeared to be fragile, pretty little outfits, but they were made of nylon, early nylon. You sweated like a horse. We all had to take salt pills or we'd faint from sweating so much. And also the trains went through. Though the CN was very good, they actually altered their schedule, because usually the first great zonking train would go through right in the middle of the first great speech of the play. So they changed it. But it was exhilarating. And we were young and strong. I couldn't do it again.
The rain.
Oh, the rain, you couldn't hear a sound when the rain came. It just patter, patter, patter on the roof. Well, it was like hail. So you couldn't hear a sound, so we'd just keep going. Or sometimes we'd cancel and say, we'll wait till it stops. But there was one glorious performance of Oedipus Rex, which I wasn't in, so I was able to go to every performance because it was magnificent. And it was raining to start with, and then the rain stopped, but it was still very kind of grey in the tent. Then just as James Mason in his great golden mask stepped up on the little riser thing and said, "I am the child of good luck," the sun came out. It was absolutely spectacular. And suddenly the tent was filled with this great golden light. It was those kind of funny little onomatopoetic miracles. I've been longing to use that word. I'm not even sure that's how you pronounce it. Too bad Lister isn't here, he'd know. Oh, but I think he's genuinely humble in the face of the theatre. You know, most people are, and they know how difficult it is.
He doesn't seem to take enough credit for his own style.
Oh, well, yes, he's always been modest about that. He's got plenty of the rest of us to talk about him.
Yeah. Fair enough. Are we ready? Good. Okay, we have a quote here. Don't be misled by the delicate fey-like quality that conceals a will of steel, and she is a remarkable actress. What is that about a will of steel? You have a reputation.
Well, I guess it dates back to, as I say, my rather passive determination when I was a little girl to be an actress, in spite of anybody else's good advice. And you need a will of steel if you're going to find the stamina and the energy to play. You know, it's not fun playing Blanche Dubois. It is enormously exciting and interesting, but not fun. It hurts. And you need a will of steel to get to the theatre and think, oh, why am I doing this to myself? Come on, get on with it and find the joy in the middle of it and keep on going.
What are you drawing on then, and what do most actors draw on? Is it
themselves, their own experiences. As I say to kids now, if I'm working with student actors, you know, you don't have to have experienced what huge grief by the loss of a family or the loss of a state, or you've lost something you loved. All you have to know is that what grief feels like. People might not think it was very important that your little dog died, but you know what real grief is. So use that memory to inform the life that you're playing, and the audience will have griefs of their own that they will draw on too. But it's very, Michael Langham, another great director at Stratford, used to say, if audiences in Shakespeare, because it is a strange language, if they can see your mind at work and they can see why you choose to go in the direction you do, then they will be moved. If all they see is your emotion, they'll say, oh, poor thing, suffering a lot, but they won't be moved themselves. Doesn't mean that you play coldly. It just means use the mind as well as the volcano that lives inside every human being.
Speaking of volcanoes inside human beings, if we talk about an instinctive player, we might think of Kate Reid.
Mm-hmm.
They say that she could drink heavily for a few weeks and then attend a party and look fantastic.
Mm-hmm. It's quite true.
Could you sum her up in a thumbnail?
Well, Kate was very simply a great actress. She had a large element of self-destruction in her personality. Sometimes she used to make people angry because she wouldn't work hard enough, you know, just simply learn the lines, turn up to rehearsals, not a little off-center. But when she delivered the goods, she was magnificent. Those great eyes. She was very beautiful in an odd sort of way. She was unique.
Do you do much radio drama?
I do, not a great deal. I like doing it. I'm frightened to death of it because I think it's the toughest of all the media to work in, because you haven't got your face to help you. You haven't got your gestures to help you. What you have to do is think very clearly, because if your thinking goes fuzzy, it immediately reflects in the voice, and people just stop believing you. It's real tough. If working with people like John Draney, the masters of the craft early on, was a big help.
What was it like working with AA Andrew Allen?
Oh, well, it's like all the stories you hear. He was Mr. Allen. The rehearsals were formally conducted, in order not to waste time. No gossip, lots and lots of gossip afterwards when we all went out for a drink together and things, but he was enormously erudite. If you were doing one of the great Greek plays or Shakespeare or whatever, he had researched it very well. You were never left in any doubt as to what the intention was at this point, which made it exciting to play with him. Also, it was enormous fun to be in a studio with a full orchestra. A full symphonic orchestra there to accompany the words. It was thrilling.
Did you do any of the stage series?
No. I heard those when I was still in Regina as a high school, and they were wonderful. I'll never forget The Legend of Lost Lagoon. He was a Peterson. All sorts of. They were magnificent, just wonderful, and nobody could speak while they were going on because they were so. He said, "Shut up." Oh yes, it was a great series. But then I went to England and missed the initiation of the series in Toronto. And when I came back, I played at Stratford, and then I was asked by Andrew to do As You Like It, I think it was. And I was simply terrified, going in that studio with Frank Petty and John Draney. I mean, I played with Gielgud and Edith Evans, and they weren't nearly as terrifying as playing with these great Canadian radio stars.
But it was a challenge. It was new for you. Was that exciting?
Yeah, well, I had done radio in England as well, but not that explorative kind of radio.
This is from a world gone by, the radio period,
I think it's a world coming back really fast. The listening audience now for radio is increasing by leaps and bounds. That, the Sunday series and the CBC of, the Michael Ondaatje and so on. And there is something so wonderful about listening to radio drama because there's nothing to interfere. You'd be comfortable, you can sit there and sip a beer or a glass of wine if you want, but there's nothing to distract you. And it creates a wonderful world. It's more like reading, I guess, where you are seeing in your mind's eye what you're reading about.
You do almost strictly Shakespearean stuff with the radio.
No, I've done a lot of children's work. Lister has thrown in a couple of Hecubas and things at me. No, I've done a lot of contemporary stuff on both radio and television for CBC.
You played Lady Utterwood in Heartbreak House
Mm-hmm.
in 1968 with Paxton Whitehead.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to
And
me
Darling Jess Tandy, whom we've just lost.
You remember, does that stand out in your mind as a wonderful experience?
Yes, it was absolutely enchanting. We were playing, at that time, the Shaw didn't have the other theatres, it just played in the little courthouse theatre. It was an exquisite set. It was directed by Val Gielgud, who was Sir John's brother, and a director of great eminence in England. It's a marvellously funny play. And I remember I was talking to Jess 2 or 3 years ago when I was doing a play, and she was filming here, and we got together. And we were talking about the wigs. She was, as the play demands, was dark-haired, black-haired, and I was a blonde. But there was nobody really in the area who knew anything about wig dressing, except this young man who ran a little hairdressing shop in St. Catherine's. And because he just didn't know what to do with wigs at the time, mine used to come back sort of glued. And I'd take all the pins out and brush it out and put it up. And Jess used to look sometimes, if she wasn't very careful, a bit like Catty Shaw in the Mikado in a road company, about the Fourth Road Company. There's a source of great delight to us. But we managed to cope. That young man, I may say, got fascinated with wigs, went to London and studied at one of the great wig schools there, and is now the chief wig maker and dresser at Stratford. a nice little success story.
That's excellent.
Yeah, it was a charming and delightful production, and very well reviewed, and
Here's a quote
fun.
of yours. You were playing opposite John Draney in Grand Exit, and you said, "None of us understood the play too well."
Oh, the Jacques Longuerrand. I had the good fortune to meet Jacques Longuerrand when I was in Ottawa for the GGs not long ago. I think he was writing ahead of his time. Or it may have been that the translation, perhaps, I don't even remember who did it, was not easy for us to grasp. But I have never forgotten the play. And I asked him if there had been a revival in Quebec of his earlier plays, and he said to his surprise, yes, they'd come around again. I think he was a bit like Pinter or John Whiting. He was really writing ahead of his time, and people didn't kind of recognize. We all knew it was an important play. We just felt we didn't have the technique. It was so unfamiliar to us that we weren't sure we were being very good in it.
Speaking of being familiar with things, there's another quote of yours which I like here. Just 3 words to describe the tenor of Canadian theatre. Just too bloody solemn.
Yes, well, that's not so much the case anymore, especially not since George Walker came on the scene. It's impossible to be solemn in the presence of George Walker. But it's less. It's just less. Well, you know, in those early days, because we were doing the classics a great deal to begin with, but also there was an air of great seriousness of purpose because we were up against such enormous odds. It wasn't because we weren't having an enormous amount of fun doing them. It just was rather solemnly regarded as. I remember doing a production, matinee, one afternoon of Twelfth Night at Stratford, which is, I still think, the best production of Twelfth Night I am aware of. And we were playing to an entire audience of high school kids, you know. Not a laugh, not a titter, nothing. And at the interval we said, what, you know, why? But apparently some of the teachers were going up and down the aisles, and when the kids started to laugh, they'd say, shh, this is Shakespeare. So it might have been a not a very good knowledge of the text we were doing that made them be greeted with such solemnity. I'm not quite sure.
Very humorous. You played a prairie wife in an NFB, NFB's first feature film, or was it your first feature film?
No, The Drylanders, yeah.
Can you tell me what it was like kind of going home in that way?
Well, I liked it. Enjoyed the experience very much because it was a chance for me to tell the story of people that I knew. This was about a young couple who went out in the, when did we get out there? About 19, I can't remember whether it was around 1912 or whether it was just post-war. And worked so hard and lived in a sod hut and things. Worked so hard. And it was for me too, thinking when we were doing a scene in a blizzard where he'd gone off to get supplies and I was left alone in the soddy with 2 little kids and thinking, my God, what must it have been like? She must have had those 2 children here all alone in this little sod hut, the howling blizzards outside. Made me have a very large appreciation for the pioneers who came out there early. And then it carries this couple through the lives of themselves and their children, and then you hit the dry years, and then the old man dies of exhaustion and overwork and discouragement. And as he has just died, the rains come back. And that hit home for me because I saw people get very old and very discouraged. It didn't rain at all in the town I was in for 7 years, you know. So it was wonderful to be able to be part of that story.
In that film, you aged from 30 to 60 in the character, and
no, I think it was from 22 to 65, if I remember rightly.
And at the same time, you were rehearsing in the Crest, Cleopatra playing a 17-year-old bride.
Yeah, well, I wasn't at the same time because, of course, we were filming out in Saskatchewan. When I came back, I played Cleopatra, yes.
Speaking of films again, were you around when they did the NFB film on Stratford experience?
Yes, yes. I think Herbie Whittaker and I are sitting on the stage chatting away about that. I think I was playing Desdemona. That's yes, I seem to remember a long red wig. Yeah. Not the very first Stratford adventure, of course, because I wasn't there the first year.
I met the film. Was that then the golden age of Canadian stage when Stratford came along, then Shaw followed?
Oh, I don't think so. Any more than, people talk about the golden days of CBC when we were doing an enormous amount of video drama. And thinking, no, I didn't think it was anything. It was a golden time to be an actor, to be sure, because the challenges were so huge. I think it's pretty golden at the moment. You look at what's happening in Toronto. It's happening often in very small theatres, playing to very small audiences, not because they're not coming, but because the theatre isn't very big. And the range of material is absolutely staggering. And it's new material, and it's old material, and it's everything you can think of in between. I think the theatre community in Toronto is absolutely astounding.
Doesn't it depend on people of a certain nature? Because isn't it hard to make a living?
Yes, it's very hard to make a living.
Can you give me an idea what kind of figures we're dealing with? What kind of
No, I don't now. I achieved a certain 15 minutes worth of fame by saying on the Zosky show years ago, when he asked me, well, what do you make? And I said, in the theatre, about 10 thou. If I do television, of course, I make more. And there's this long silence, and Peter looked bewildered, and I turned around and looked behind me in the booth, and there was nobody there. I thought somebody was ill in the booth. So we went off air, and I said, what's the matter? And he said, I just don't know what to say to you. I said, about what? And he said, well, I had no idea that you people were not doing well. But that's part of the old myth. People read in the TV guide that so-and-so makes $150,000 an episode. So they sort of assume that if you're working quite frequently, that's what you're making. Well, of course you aren't. The Tarragon and the Factory Lab and Passe Muraille, all those theatres pay what they can. They are as generous as they can possibly be. But of course it's not very much. And of course you're grateful if you do get. Even if it means not a very interesting role, but 2 days filming for a movie of the week or something, gives you a little breathing room. So I don't decry it.
So often we measure a profession's success by the kind of money you make. Clearly it's not the case in Canadian theatre per se. What is success in Canadian theatre? Just working?
Hanging in there long enough and they keep employing you, I guess.
You played ladies, a quote of yours, I played ladies with a great deal of emotional pain. On occasion they had affairs with men, but the audience seemed to tolerate that quite well because they were so miserable.
Oh, you mean the characters were miserable? Yeah. Yes, as long as they suffered for their...
What's the mindset? Why did they have to suffer?
Well, they're women and they shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't be disobeying their daddy if they're Regan and Goneril. They should be respectful, and they are temples of purity and goodness, and if they betray that trust, they deserve to suffer.
Is this a memorable role? CBC Folio series, you did a few of those. Proud Passage with Douglas Rain. I haven't heard much about Douglas Rain. What was it like working with Douglas Rain?
Oh, Douglas is one of my most beloved people in the whole world. And there was a time when if they phoned me from the CBC, I would just say, what's Douglas playing? Because we played brothers and sisters and husbands and wives and mortal enemies and for donkey's years. He's a delight to play with. He's a most extraordinary actor, very economical, people sometimes say, but he seems cold. And I say, oh, rubbish. Did you see him play the munitions maker in Major Barbara? I sat for 20 minutes in an uncomfortable little stool every night listening to him defend his, and I never failed to be moved every single night he got to me.
Opposite John Draney and Lloyd Faulkner on the Infanta series again, you played the Infanta, on the Folio series rather, in Queen After Death.
With Kate.
Yes, with Kate Reid. This sounds like an interesting mix. Lloyd Faulkner also hasn't come up a lot in our discussions because, of course, he made a transition to the film in the States.
Yes.
But what sort of mark did he make before we talk about?
Well, he was graceful and handsome and generous and funny. Usually played the rather solemn ones like the Duke in Measure for Measure and so on. Whereas, in fact, it was always great fun to see him make an absolute idiot of himself and in some comic role because he was very good. I haven't really been in touch with Lloyd for years and years. I see his son's coming along now and what's his name? Doing quite a lot of stuff in LA now. Another young Faulkner to keep an eye open for.
And how was it working with Kate?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. We always had a ball playing together. Of course, they used to get a little fed up with us because it was the wrong time of the year. They generally couldn't find us because we were somewhere else watching the World Series, but that used to annoy them a little. Wouldn't have been a problem this year, would it?
I see you both acted with and been directed by Barry Morris.
Have I ever been directed by Barry? Don't think so. I've certainly acted with him a good deal.
He was at Shaw at least that year you were there when he was...
Yes, but I didn't work in one of his productions, no. I'm sure he's very good.
Can you tell me about your knowledge of Barry?
Just that he's one of those incredible old pros who never seems to slow down or stop, you know. If you want anecdotes, you should get hold of Barry Morris. He's got a gazillion for you.
That is true. And I understand that for a couple of years you played on the drama Neighbours, with Billy D. Williams. It's coming up more recently.
Neighbours, yes.
Diefenbaker had a quote about it. What happened?
Well, Neighbours, which is a very good play, is about a rather straight-laced schoolmarmy sort of woman and her black neighbour who lives in the apartment below, who comes up one day and apologizes because he's very fond of Bruckner and he plays Bruckner very loudly and he wants to know if it's bothering her at all. Not at all, she said, no, it hasn't been. But they get into a conversation and gradually his bitterness begins to come out, his feeling of being a racist victim. And she, who is under the impression that she doesn't have any of that, racism, discovers that she's, in fact, probably does. And eventually he makes a sexual advance at her, and she says, all right, prove it. And he can't. And that's the end of the play. The two separate worlds, and they're just two people lying there on a bed staring at the ceiling thinking, oh God, what's happened? It's a very good play, and it was wonderful working with Billy D. That produced one of my favorite fan letters from a lady in Saskatchewan who said, Dear Miss Hyland, my husband and I have been devoted fans of yours for many years. We will now never watch you again, having seen you in that play with that black man. Well, you know, having utterly, of course, missed the whole point of the play. And she said, we are particularly disappointed because of your exquisite Goneril last summer at Stratford. Well, Goneril, as you may or may not know, is one of the wicked sisters in King Lear who shoved their father out on the moor to die. That my exquisite Goneril. I did have a pretty frock on, but she poisons her sister, gets rid of her husband very conveniently and shoves her father out in the moor. But I was exquisite as Goneril, but because I lay on a bed with Billy D. Williams, I hope them days is gone.
I understand it's probably your favorite role as St. Joan, as well Lady Macbeth. Do you find that
No, neither of them were my favorites.
I think the word probably.
Yes.
Probably.
Well,
you were often cast as St. Joan.
No, I just played that one. I also played, which isn't nearly as satisfying, the ennui play, The Lark, in Chicago. But after playing Shaw's Joan, who was a very formidable character, playing The Lark was there's a poor little girl that had the misfortune to be burned. I think maybe it's translation too. As I do know, my French is rotten, I can read a bit, but I do remember reading the original text, and when finally she's struggling and talking to God and saying, why is this happening to me? And comes to the conclusion, I see. You are saying that we have to assume the responsibility for our own lives. And she ends with, et alors, mon Dieu, j'assume, j'assume. And then goes off to the stake. And it didn't kind of work out like that in the translation we were using, which is kind of sentimental.
Guthrie didn't take you as a standard Lady Macbeth. How's that?
I didn't play Macbeth for Tony. I played it for Dougie Campbell in the Canadian Players. Well, I don't know. What is the standard about Lady Macbeth? What is the standard about any of those characters? The important thing to remember about Lady Macbeth, as I keep saying to young actresses who are tackling it, is that when she has that great speech about, I've forgotten it, she appeals to demons and to evil spirits, unsex me here and fill me from top to toe, top full of direst cruelty, that what happens to her is that she succeeds. And that's precisely what does happen to her. And hence she is able to go ahead with the murder. And afterwards she suffers such terrible loss of personality and such frightful guilt and grief that of course it drives her crazy. But it's important to remember that she succeeds in her strong wish.
Of course, in Britain, where you worked quite a bit, everyone's seen a Shakespeare done this way, that way, the other way they've grown up with. And here it was a little of an open ballpark. Can you tell me about that?
You mean in London?
No, here in Canada, it was unlike London, where everyone's seen and is very familiar with the Shakespeare.
Yes, that's true.
Why was the spirit different here?
Well, partly because the audience didn't quite know what to expect. They hadn't seen 14 Hamlets and 8 Lears and so on and so forth, and partly because we didn't know what we were doing a lot of the time. We're not coming from that long tradition, so we were obliged to find our way newly into it.
Cecil Clark you worked with.
Mm-hmm.
How was that?
He was a very delightful man and a wonderful administrator, but my own experience was that he was not very successful as a director, so it was a little disconcerting.
Was that a disaster for the Measure production that he directed?
Well, apparently it wasn't a disaster because people came in long numbers, and some of them still say to me, I will never forget you and James Mason in those scenes. We neither of us felt that we were terribly successful in it.
Okay. Herbert Whittaker said of you, an actress of unusual versatility whose mannered style is often characterized as autocratic.
Don't know what he meant by that. I think it must have been like my favorite quote from John Ross Colombo, who says an actress with a very mannered way of speaking or an odd way of speaking or something. I think that's partly because of in the early days of Stratford. Of course, I come from England, where I was speaking with an English accent, and I was only gradually finding my way to my own voice. So I probably was very mannered. Probably quite boring.
The Dominion Drama Festival, there was an adjudicator named Robert Spate.
Spate.
Okay, thanks. His memoirs list figures who caught his attention, and he lists Robertson Davies, William Hunt, and yourself.
Well, that I think is because when I was given the money to come to Ottawa from Saskatoon to audition for Mr. Spate, it was I had to go to Redo Hall, which was pretty scary for a little girl who didn't know much about grand households. And I bought a new suit, bright electric blue with a hat to match. I was pretty spiffy, I think. And I took a taxi from the hotel to Redo Hall and was met by a butler, which is very disconcerting. Never met one except in a Noel Coward play before. And ushered into a library, which is rather grand. And then there sat and waited for a while until this nice man came in.